By escalating raids against the resistance factions, the United States of America is venturing to tilt the Iraqi position decisively towards the demand for a complete American withdrawal, as well as providing a strong incentive for the factions to escalate in return. The pace of escalation is rising day after day against American interests in Iraq at a time when Mustafa Al-Kadhemis' government is preparing to start the fourth round of the strategic dialogue, which will discuss a complete withdrawal of the American occupation forces instead of scheduling the withdrawal as agreed upon in the third round held last April. This shift in the Iraqi position came against the backdrop of the exchange of bombings between the Americans and the resistance factions, which began from mid-June and reached the 28th of June when an American raid targeted a camp belonging to the Popular Mobilization Forces on the border strip between Syria and Iraq. The raids of the American occupation come to save Washington's face, especially after the repeated attacks that confused the Biden administration, in addition to the security and military losses suffered by his troops. It is now clear that the purpose of the Americans' continued escalation is to drag the Iraqi factions into an all-out war inside Baghdad and then in areas south of Iraq to create internal chaos. It's worth noting that since Biden took office at the beginning of this year, most of the American bombing operations have targeted the Iraqi resistance factions inside Syria, where they operate in coordination with the Syrian Arab Army. This explains the importance of the region for Washington, especially as it represents the soft loin that Daesh exploits to restore its activity. Hence, ladies and gents, behold the American Air Force being used again as Daesh ISIS Air Force simply to keep Syria destabilized. The Iraqi resistance factions have retaliated by launching about 12 attacks on American occupation bases in Iraq since last February. This will for sure represent real pressure for the Iraqi government to resolve the issue of the US occupation as soon as possible before the ball of confrontation rolls and burns what is left of American interests on Iraqi soil. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The pace of escalation is rising day after day against American interests in Iraq at a time when Mustafa Al-Kadhemis' government is preparing to enter the fourth round of the strategic dialogue, which will discuss a complete withdrawal of the American occupation forces, instead of scheduling the withdrawal as agreed upon in the third round held last April. Now, this shift in the Iraqi position came in light of the exchange of fire between the American occupation and the resistance factions, which began in June, when an American raid targeted a camp belonging to the Hashd al-Shabi on the border strip between Syria and Iraq. Meanwhile, the American embassy in Baghdad was then targeted hours after American interests in western Iraq and other areas in neighboring Syria were similarly bombed. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Mr. Mohammed Abaid, political commentator. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Mohammed. Now, by escalating these raids against the resistance factions in Iraq, the US is venturing to tilt the Iraqi position decisively towards the full demand of a full withdrawal from Iraqi soil. Now, if the withdrawal is the ultimate goal for real for the American occupation, why are the Biden administration and the US forces escalating their fire against the Iraqi resistance?
First of all, we have to take into account that the escalation came after the negotiations between the Iraqi government and the US administration has led nowhere. So here we have a situation in which the Americans sometimes say they are withdrawing, sometimes they say they are preparing to have a training courses for the Iraqi armed forces and the Iraqi police and etc. Other times you see them barricading in their embassy, which is a huge size of land in Baghdad. So you cannot be sure about this issue that the Americans want to withdraw. Now, when you deal with a country as such, this means you are telling the people of this country that you are an occupation force, and consequently they are going to deal with you as such. So the Americans all the time are trying to portray the issue as that the Iranians are, the Iranian-backed militias are targeting our interests and our bases in Iraq. If you note how much they pump this propaganda war in this regard, you will understand that people are tending to forget that the Americans are an occupation force in Iraq, and consequently they are going to be dealt with likewise, meaning as an occupation force. So these are the main things that we need to take into account whenever we are tackling the issue. Now you see that the Americans are getting a lot of strikes from the Iraqi resistance. We need to underline the word resistance because there's an occupation force, and consequently they cannot retaliate with the way that, for instance, Trump would have wanted. And even if Trump was there, and I mean the Trump administration, the American army would not, and the American Navy would not agree to an escalation, because they know about their weaknesses in Iraq. They know about their weaknesses that have come in the last decade in the region and in the whole world as in general.
Mr. Mohammed, what's very interesting is that since the beginning of this year, we have seen more than 50 attacks. One were actually said that happened by the U.S. administration. Others they were silent about, that targeted U.S. interests in Iraq, especially the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, the Iraqi military bases that house U.S. troops in them, and the Erbil airport as well. We all remember that. In attacks often always attributed to the Iraqi resistance forces. In the event these attacks just increase and continue targeting U.S. occupation forces in Iraq, how do you think that the Iraqi government will maneuver around this fact in the upcoming talks?
Well, you have to take into account the complications that Mr. Kadhemi is facing. You know, the Kadhemi was sort of a figure that was chosen to be in the middle between all parties, and you cannot be such a person and such a politician when you have a very complicated situation as the one in the Middle East in general, and specifically in Iraq, between all these forces that are around you. I mean, the Islamic Republic of Iran neighboring you, and you have the American administration and American troops occupying Baghdad. You have the Saudis intervening from here or there. You have other Gulf countries also. So it's a very complicated situation, and you notice that the Iraqi government is trying to please everyone. Whenever an American strike takes place, they criticize, for instance, slightly, but when the resistance retaliates, they try to make those who carried out the operation as people who are not known, etc. So they are in a very, in a real dilemma in this regard in order how to deal with issues, because the issues are going in a very fast pace, and they cannot deal with the situation because of its all complications.
Well, it should be noted there, Mr. Mohammed, that since the Biden administration took the presidency in the U.S. At the beginning of this year, most of the American bombing campaigns have targeted the factions, the Iraqi factions, Iraqi resistance inside Syria, where they coordinate with the Syrian Arab Army, their operations there, because it is the perfect spot, the soft loin that Daesh, ISIS usually exploits to try and restore its activity. How on earth does the world not condemn the U.S. basically being Daesh Air Force there? They are playing the role of protecting the area for ISIS to return to that area. How does the world just keep silent?
Well, the world is keeping silent because of the American hegemony over the media all over the world, and so the things are quite clear in this regard. I mean, even when you go back to the times when I know this has been reiterated a lot, the Trump declaration that it was Clinton who created Daesh, and on the issue of the scandal of the emails, etc. But still, the whole world knows, and even Iraqis sometimes had videotapes and footage of the American helicopters just withdrawing the ISIS militiamen from certain areas and moving them to other areas. So the whole world knows, but remains silent, as is the case with the Palestinian issue, which is completely a just cause, and the whole world is turning the blind eye to that, the Israeli massacres and the situation in Lebanon with the American pressures and so that are starving people here. So all over the world you have right is right and wrong is wrong, and things are right clear. But unfortunately, the American administration is sort of terrorizing and bullying all the media and all over the world, and all the politicians all over the world. Some of them subdue to the pressure, others reject this, and consequently would be confronting the American interests and American plans. But unfortunately, most of the world is just subduing to these pressures by the Americans.
Well, the dilemma of the White House is that it sees maintaining a small, what they called a focused mission inside of Iraq and inside of Syria as well, a worthwhile alternative to a complete full withdrawal of their forces. Yet obviously the Iraqi resistance will not stop its fight back. They will always keep targeting the US occupation forces as long as they remain there. And obviously we've seen similar attacks against their bases in Syria as well. How do you think the Iraqi resistance will maybe receive a possible decision by the US to relocate from Baghdad and maybe go forward northwards Kurdistan? How will they deal with that?
Well, I'm sure also the strategists I'm not going only to talk about the Iraqi resistance here, I'm talking about the axis of resistance in the whole region, is reading very clearly the strategic weaknesses that have grown up and grown in the as far as the American administration is concerned in the whole region and in the whole world in general. We are talking about militarily wise and economically and in many other domains. So you have to take into account all these things and disregard whatever the Americans are trying to spread in their propaganda and in their media about their aim to help and assist the poor Iraqi people. They are trying to assist us here in Lebanon, with besieging us and banning us from getting any necessities that we need to live as a people. So the Americans are doing one thing and on the one hand and quite the opposite on the other. And while all the time claiming to be the force of good in the whole world, which is the utmost contrast of truth and
well, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed Abed, political commentator, for joining us to talk about the latest attacks against U.S. occupation forces in Iraq and possibly also in the future in Syria. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, please stay tuned. Next, we will be talking about the life and the loss of a Palestinian leader in Damascus. Stay with us. A fighter. This is how Ahmad Jibril spent his stormy life, witnessing the smallest details of the Palestinian struggle ever since the Zionist gangs of the first settlers uprooted the pillars of his family home in the village of Yazur near Jaffa in 1948 when he was just 10 years old. Since then, Jibril finally chose to cover his face with the dust of Damascus after he had discovered the secrets of geography between Palestine and the Levant interior and learned the language of the water flowing towards the south with bullets and longing to return to the basil and lemon gardens in Yazur. Jibril was laid to rest in his beloved Damascus last week after decades of struggle for liberation that seems today closer than ever because of the thoughts and activism of the likes of late Ahmad Jibril. More in the following report.
On a sad day, July 7, 2021, a great Palestinian icon, Ahmad Jibril Abu Jihad, one of the founders of the contemporary Palestinian Revolution and the Palestine Liberation Organization, passed away in Damascus. With his departure, the Palestinian national movement and the Palestinian people, as well as the Arab and Islamic nation and the free people of the world, lost a stubborn fighter who did not know despair nor submission. The idea of fighting for Palestine persisted over Jibril's purpose in life. Instead of pursuing higher education, he joined the Syrian army and moved to the military college in Cairo to graduate as a combat lieutenant. Jibril quickly used his knowledge in order to build a force of Fidaiyin, fighters for Palestine, to revenge the taking of Palestine by illegal settlers and the Zionist occupation army. He contributed to the establishment of the Palestine Liberation Front and then the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Jibril's bias towards geography was a sufficient reason to establish the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command in 1968 and to separate from the Popular Front and before it from the Fatah movement and its leader Yasser Arafat. He instead chose an alliance with the late President Hafez al-Assad in 1970, an alliance that Jibril remained loyal to until he descended on Friday, July 7, under the soil of the cemetery of the martyrs in Yarmouk camp, south of Damascus. Throughout the years of conflict, the General Command did not miss the fateful battles. From fighting at home in Palestine to confronting the enemy in Lebanon, Jibril planned, organized, led, and won most of the battles he fought. From the hotel war against the forces of the Lebanese front at that time, which was fought in Beirut with the support of the occupation army, to facing the 1982 invasion of Lebanon on most of the battlefronts, from the south to the coastal line to the capital and Hamdoun to the central Biqa', especially in the famous battles of Sultan Yaqub, to the famous mountain war in which the General Command and the Syrian artillery were involved with great influence, so the battle against the Lebanese forces militia was decided at the time. As for the icon of Jibril's achievements, it was the gliders operation in 1987, which aimed to reach an occupation camp in the Galilee using gliders launched from Lebanon. This military achievement was one of the reasons for the outbreak of the First Intifada that year, in which Jibril and the General Command played a prominent role in fueling it and providing it with moral and material support. Ahmad Jibril excelled in everything. His deep political vision prompted him to root the General Command's relations with the various resistance factions and parties that engaged in fighting, especially Hezbollah and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, where they all carried out several joint operations. Ahmad Jibril did not leave his two sons, Jihad and Khalid, trust funds and palaces. Rather, they inherited a life project that ends with death solely for Palestine.
Now, to discuss the life of this brave man, with us from Damascus is Mr. Tahseen Al-Halabi, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Tahseen. Now, late Ahmad Jibril's bias towards geography was a sufficient reason to establish the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the General Command, in 1968. How do you view the contribution of late Jibril to the fight to liberate Palestine?
You know, in the beginning, Comrade Jibril, he vowed all his life for Palestine, for liberating Palestine. And he also vowed the lives of his 4 children for Palestine, for liberating Palestine. He lost one, Jihad, the oldest one, as a revenge from the Israeli occupation when they targeted him in Beirut on 2002 in Beirut, because they knew that he was the one that sent from the Sea of Beirut to Gaza lot of weapons and lot of explosives and rockets for the revolution, for the resistance of the Palestinian factions in Gaza. Mm-hmm. Jibril's legacy really is very rich, very also deep in the roots of this resistance. From the beginning, he found that there was no way but to go to the military academy on 1957 to Egypt. In the beginning, he volunteered to the Syrian army, and he made course for to be an officer, and then he requested to go to the Academy of Cairo in order to get more knowledge about guerrilla warfare, not for conventional armies and conventional weapons for armies. He went there in order to get the background of military activities, of military operations, and then he turned by himself to the knowledge of the expertise of the guerrilla warfare. For this reason, he was the one that graduated from the Academy of Egypt in the specialty of mines and engineering military positions and wireless also communications.
Well, Mr. Tahsin, in relation to the current events happening at the moment as we speak in occupied Palestine, how do you think the mental model of Ahmed Jibril can affect the current wave of revolution against the occupation and also against the police state now cracking down on the Palestinian natives?
Jibril knew his road very well and knew the ways of how to confront the occupation forces. Therefore, when the Oslo Accords was signed by PLO leadership and Israel, he was the one that called all the Palestinian masses inside occupied Palestine to protest, to be against such accords, and to try to make any way to go to the road of resistance. From that moment, he started to receive hundreds of Palestinian youth from West Bank and Gaza Strip in Damascus, in the headquarters of the PFLP General Command. And they were trained here for few weeks or more than 2 months from Hamas and from Jihad Islami. Many young Palestinian individuals, Palestinian Fidaiyin, came here to his headquarters in Damascus, in Syria, and were getting all the making how of explosives, of weapons, of rockets, of lot of things. And he made certain
he embodied, he basically embodied the real resistance of the Palestinians
in front of them.
Mr. Tahsin, Jibril believed that Palestine is an Arab issue, and he rejected all attempts to isolate it from its Arab depth because of his belief that the liberation of Palestine is an Arab task and not only a Palestinian task, because the Zionist danger does not threaten the Palestinian people alone, it threatens all of us and even goes past the Arab world. Where do you see the current Arab position from all the new changes happening inside Palestine right now?
From the beginning, he knew very well that no faction alone or with other factions, with other Palestinian factions, can liberate Palestine by his own capabilities and military equipments and military activities. He knew that the Palestinian factions should be the spear of the Arab armies that will participate in any war against the occupation forces inside Palestine. He wanted that those factions to be the pioneers on the road of guerrilla war against the Israeli occupation, whether inside Palestine or across the borders, from Jordan, from the Golan Heights boundaries, from South Lebanon, from Gaza, from all those boundaries surrounding Palestine. He tried to prepare such activities and giving trainings, military trainings for hundreds of Palestinians in order to do that, but not believing at all that the only Palestinian factions can liberate Palestine. he needed the Arab armies around surrounding Palestine, occupied Palestine, to participate and to share with this victorious war against
Mr.
the Israeli
Tahsin
occupation.
Al-Halabi, Mr. Tahsin Al-Halabi, a political commentator, we celebrate today a man like Mr. Ahmad Jibril, and we celebrate men like you who have a great history in a struggle against the Zionist occupation on the road to the freedom of Palestine. Thank you very much for joining us from Damascus to celebrate with us this fallen hero. Thank you very much for being with us, and please stay tuned next week for more from our Mideastream.